Howdy viewers, my name is Henry, and this is Wild West Film School. In today's episode, we're covering High Noon. Directed by Fred Zinnemann, High Noon was released in 1952 by United Artists. Gary Cooper stars as Marshal Will Kane, who on the morning of his wedding day in retirement as a lawman, receives word that notorious outlaw Frank Miller, whom Kane had arrested and sent to prison years earlier, has been released. Now, Miller is coming back for revenge, arriving on the noon train. For such a straightforward setup, High Noon is rather subversive as a western, nor is it structured like any western I've seen. The film essentially takes place in real time, as the looming threat of Miller's arrival builds throughout the day, creating an atmosphere of dread, and as the clock ticks closer to noon, a real sense of foreboding terror. Kane's newlywed wife, Amy, is a Quaker and a pacifist. She pleads with Kane to just leave town and retire as they'd planned, but he insists that he must stay and face Miller. Having served the town for years, Kane's sure that he'll have no problem rounding up volunteers to stand beside him as deputies, and spends the course of the film trying to do so. However, due to the reluctance and cowardice of the townsfolk, when the clock finally does strike noon, Kane finds himself standing alone, left to die by those he'd spent years protecting. Before diving into the filmmaking of High Noon, we have to establish the cultural context. Even a casual cinephile is at least somewhat familiar with the Western genre's association with Depression era and post-war escapism. The black and white morality of the era put themes like American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, and idealized masculinity at the forefront of early westerns. And while the film does tackle these somewhat, specifically masculinity, which we'll get back to later, one cannot discuss High Noon without mentioning McCarthyism and how the Red Scare shaped Hollywood in the 1950s. Due to the left-wing politics of many directors, screenwriters, and actors, Hollywood found itself front and center amongst fears of Soviet espionage infiltrating the American elite and conspiracies of communists secretly shaping the entertainment industry. Congress formed the House of Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC, dedicated to investigating these suspected communists. Actors and filmmakers would be subpoenaed and blacklisted from working in Hollywood, many of whom never returned to the industry. High Noon's screenwriter, Carl Foreman, found himself in the crosshairs of the HUAC. Seeing the betrayal and complacency of his longtime colleagues in the industry firsthand, Foreman took John W. Cunningham's initial short story, The Tin Star, and transformed it into an exploration of mob psychology, saying, "A lot of the dialogue was almost the dialogue that I was hearing from people and even in the company. You could walk down the street and see friends of yours recognize you, turn, and walk the other way. As I was writing the screenplay, it became insane, because life was mirroring art and art was mirroring life. It was all happening at the same time. I became that guy. I became the Gary Cooper character." This context takes High Noon's already masterful thematic exploration and enriches it into an allegorical time capsule of the period. I'd also like to note that because of this, John Wayne hated High Noon, calling it un-American, because of course he did. I wouldn't go as far as to classify High Noon as a revisionist western per se, but certainly atypical of the genre. The sense of bravado and sweeping scale of its contemporaries has been stripped down to something far more intimate and reflective. Shot on 35mm black and white with a taller 1.37:1 aspect ratio, High Noon is far more interested in framing people than scenery. Not that the film isn't a visual delight, showcasing stunning contrast and intricate blocking. Visual motifs like clocks or trains benefit greatly from the taller aspect ratio. They completely overtake the frame, emphasizing the weight of these visuals in a film centered around what time a train arrives. And while a widescreen is great for capturing vast natural landscapes, the narrow vertical facades of Western architecture suit the taller frame, as the film is set almost entirely in town. While we're at it, let's talk about the setting. The fictitious Hadleyville, New Mexico may seem like a run-of-the-mill, interchangeable Western town backdrop, but it's actually one of the most realized settings I've seen in a Western. I've always loved films where the town and townsfolk are fleshed-out characters in their own right. The kinds of ensembles where a side character with one line or who appears in one scene can still be memorable. You know, films like Do the Right Thing or Friday, both of which also take place over the course of one day, funnily enough. The town of Hadleyville and its residents play a crucial role in the narrative. While Frank Miller may be the named antagonist, it's the townsfolk who drive the central conflict of the story, a conflict most realized in the church scene about halfway through the film. Up to this point, Kane has failed to find anyone who will stand beside him against Miller. So in his desperation, Kane interrupts the church service, asking the congregation for volunteer deputies. The ensuing debate displays all kinds of perspectives. Some initially jump at the opportunity to take down a violent thug like Frank Miller. Others complain about the politicians up north who set Miller free. Some complain about the taxpayer dollars not going into hiring more deputies, and others argue that this simply isn't their fight. Then, of course, there's the children who, ignorant to the situation, are just happy that church has been cut short and they can go play. The debate culminates in the opinion of the minister, with seemingly the word of God all that's left to turn to.
The commandments say, "Thou shalt not kill," but we hire men to go out and do it for us. The right and the wrong seem pretty clear here. But if you're asking me to tell my people to go out and kill, and maybe get themselves killed, I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry.
With a final plea from the mayor for Kane to leave Hadleyville while he still has the chance, Kane realizes that he's truly alone in this. The town has no intention of standing beside him. Defeated, he seeks out Martin Howe, the now retired marshal before Kane, and a paternal figure to him. Howe, played by the Wolfman himself, Lon Chaney Jr., reminds Kane of the cruel reality of his situation, and that fighting wouldn't be worth it.
You've been a lawman all your life. Yeah, all my life. It's a great life. You risk your skin catching killers, and the juries turn them loose so they can come back and shoot at you again. If you're honest, you're poor your whole life. And in the end, you wind up dying all alone on some dirty street. For what? For nothing. For a tin star.
It seems no one really understands just why Kane is so insistent on facing Miller, especially his wife. Seeking answers, Amy goes to Hadleyville's saloon to speak with the owner, Helen Ramirez, a former flame of Kane's. Katie Hirado is great in her role as Helen. She's sharp and insightful, and this conversation between her and Amy is one of the best in the film.
Then what is it? Why is he staying?
If you don't know, I cannot explain it to you.
High Noon boasts a stacked cast of seasoned A-listers and veteran character actors. There's of course Gary Cooper, the aforementioned Lon Chaney Jr., and the always great Thomas Mitchell as the mayor. Then you've got at-the-time unknowns who'd go on to become icons of film history, like Lee Van Cleef and Grace Kelly, in their first and second ever credited roles respectively. I think now is the time we finally talk about Gary Cooper as Will Kane, a performance which earned him an Academy Award for Best Actor. It's definitely a product of its time, as I'm sure modern audiences' idea of an Oscar-worthy performance would look something like this.
Every day I wake up and I hope you're dead! For my fucking daughter! My fucking... I've abandoned my child! Is that my daughter?
Where Cooper's subdued and contemplative performance might seem wooden, but I think he's masterfully dissecting the typical leading man persona found in early westerns, providing an intimate vulnerability that deconstructs the conventional masculine stoicism of the genre. Will Kane doesn't cry or scream, yet his underlying fear and turmoil is conveyed so clearly, which I find just as, if not more, impressive.
Whatever happened to Gary Cooper? The strong, silent type. That was an American. He wasn't in touch with his feelings, he just did what he had to do. See, what they didn't know was once they got Gary Cooper in touch with his feelings, that they wouldn't be able to shut him up.
Best Actor wasn't High Noon's only accolade Oscar night, also landing awards for Best Editing and Best Original Score. Fred Zinnemann was nominated twice for Best Director that year, but didn't win for High Noon, instead taking home the Oscar for From Here to Eternity. If I were to single out the moment where High Noon secured these Oscar wins, it'd be the train arrival scene. This is the sequence that really made me want to cover High Noon, as I think it's one of the greatest in film history. Cooper's performance is at its best here, as Dmitri Tiomkin's incredible score paired with Harry Gerstad and Emma Williams' masterful editing culminate in a gripping montage that leaves you on the edge of your seat. The sequence is phenomenal. The entire town of Hadleyville stops, frozen in suspense by the imminent violence to come. Earlier I referenced two visual motifs employed throughout the film, the first being a clock and the second being a shot of the train tracks, both of which are paid off here when the clock finally strikes noon and the train's whistle blares with its arrival. But there's one more visual that's paid off that I forgot to mention. At the start of the film, just after Kane receives word that Miller's coming back to Hadleyville, he goes to meet Judge Percy Metrick, the man who sentenced him. Metrick, already packing to leave town, reminds Kane of just how dangerous Miller is.
Why must you be so stupid, Will? Have you forgotten what he is? Have you forgotten what he's done to people? Have you forgotten that he's crazy? Don't you remember when he sat in that chair and said, You'll never hang me. I'll come back. I'll kill you, Will Kane. I swear it. I'll kill you.
So, the later montage culminates in the same shot of that empty chair, as if it's embodying Miller himself in Kane's impending doom. The film so far has been a rubber band, slowly pulled back and stretched, and with the end of this sequence, the rubber band has been released. It's cathartic in the most terrifying possible way. That's damn good filmmaking. I will say that Frank Miller works better as a looming threat than as an actually present antagonist, because when he finally does show up, he's just a guy. Not that I was expecting Miller to have some crazy physical deformity or scarring like a James Bond villain, but I don't know, he's built up as insane and dangerous, but comes off as just a mean dude. He barely has any lines. Maybe that's the point, but I find it sort of anticlimactic. It's like the shark in Jaws. Finally seeing the thing would never live up to whatever terrifying idea we'd conjured up in our minds. And so we have the final shootout. It opens with an excellent crane shot that conveys just how alone Kane is. Miller and his gang strut through town looking gangster as fuck, and Kane like he's about to piss his pants. Since Kane is so outnumbered, we don't get a traditional Western standoff, but more of a cat-and-mouse slow burn where he picks off Miller's gang one by one. Kane's wife even takes a guy out, which is pretty significant as she's a pacifist and was trying to get Kane to run away the whole film. She could have easily just played the wife role and been an extension to Kane, something for him to lose, but she gets her own arc. But of course, the shootout ends with Miller holding Amy at gunpoint and Kane seizing the precise moment to shoot him. Amy runs into Kane's arms, and the townsfolk somehow instantly flood the street to cheer on the couple as they ride off into the sunset. I don't hate this ending, as it's earned and satisfying, but my god is it cliche. Granted, this movie's so old we have to take into account that these cliches weren't as established as they are today, but still, for a film as smart and subversive as High Noon, this ending is so generic, and sudden too. There's not really any resolution following the climax. The climax ends and the film ends. I would have loved one last conversation from Kane, maybe with the mayor or with Hal, some reflection on the events that have transpired and what Kane has learned in the end. I will say, I do love the moment of him tossing his badge on the ground, calling back to his earlier conversation with Hal about how trivial that tin star is, but still, to me the ending falls flat. I think this is because with the themes that High Noon are tackling, it didn't need a final shootout, or a neat ending that wraps up the story with a bow. The film would have been just as effective if it turned out that Miller was never even on that Noon train. But as a classical western of the 50s, High Noon had to juggle its socio-political commentary with escapist entertainment. To me, the true climax and culmination of High Noon's themes will always be that train arrival sequence. So that's High Noon. I still do greatly admire this film, its filmmaking craft, and its cultural context. I love the flash and operatic scope of Leone or Peckinpah's westerns, but the core fundamentals of effective storytelling are on full display here, and High Noon is a must-see for anyone interested in pursuing film. I'd like to end this video with some fun facts about High Noon I found during my research. Producer Stanley Kramer initially hired Lee Van Cleef to play Deputy Marshal Harvey Pell, but later decided Van Cleef's nose was too hooked, making him look like a villain. Kramer then told Van Cleef to get his nose fixed, to which Van Cleef told him to go fuck himself. His words, not mine. Van Cleef was then given the smaller role of Jack Colby. Director Fred Zinnemann said that in the shot of the train arriving, the black smoke billowing from the chimney is a sign that the brakes were failing. He and the cameraman didn't know and just barely got out of the way in time. The camera was destroyed, but somehow the film survived, and that's the take used in the movie. High Noon's title track, Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, performed by Tex Ritter, was a milestone in film scoring and marketing. It introduced the idea of a theme song marketed separately from the movie, and to be a motif for the instrumental score throughout the film, now commonplace in the industry. Think My Heart Will Go On from Titanic, or any Bond song. Though Lon Chaney was supposed to be playing the older man and paternal figure to Gary Cooper, he was actually 5 years younger. Before Gary Cooper accepted the role, the part of Will Kane was offered to Charlton Heston, Marlon Brando, Kirk Douglas, and Gregory Peck. Peck later saying that turning down the role was one of his biggest regrets, being a liberal activist who spoke out against Hollywood blacklisting. And finally, Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly had an affair throughout the production of High Noon. Awesome. Okay, that's going to be all for today. I hope you enjoyed watching this first episode of Wild West Film School, and I'd love to hear what Western you'd want me to cover next in the comments down below.
Until I shoot Frank